I think the main space, and then Kant, as maybe people know at least a little bit, that he's one of the most famous philosophers to attempt to try to talk about this distinction in a systematic way, the distinction between appearances and things, or appearances and reality. And so part of the motivation of the session would be to look more closely at some of Kant's texts in relation to the general debates in the history of philosophy about this kind of distinction, and try to help illuminate what is his specific contribution, and in what way does he understand this distinction, and how does he understand the relation between the two parts of the distinction. And so that's, again, kind of the slightly more specific but still pretty general space of the discussion that I was hoping we could have. And the plan for the discussion would be to talk through just some basic texts in which Kant himself is talking a little bit about this distinction in an interesting way, and try to keep track of the pieces and then put together an understanding of Kant on this distinction is the goal. And then how this understanding would relate to the way other people have understood Kant is also interesting, but maybe not as interesting for our group if the research conversation about the interpretation of Kant is even more specialized than just actually reading some of Kant's text itself. And so maybe the way that I had set up, if I wanted to include the long handout with the quotes, especially if it was a group that maybe it would be as of interest just to get to read some Kant, and we could talk about it, and in that way, you could decide, do you want to read more? Is this enough? You're done. You've got like a little dose of Kant. You had your medicine. Now you can move on. And so I was thinking for our time that I have an agenda in that sense of being invested in trying to get this right. Like, how exactly does Kant talk about these things? For a lot of different reasons, I'm interested in trying to get this right. And we could talk about those too at some point, but I think as far as it sounds like people's interest in the history of philosophy, and maybe in the modern period in particular, and the German aspect of the modern period, maybe that could be enough that everybody at least has some interest independently for whatever reason. And if we could, as a team, talk through some of these texts and try to understand them and follow out some of these distinctions. So I know different people have different experiences with having even opened a book with Kant, or how much you've read, or in what way have you approached Kant's thinking. And so, but the more we can have it be everyone working together, that would be, I think, great for this kind of meeting. And then I have in the one handout that's more the organization of the, could I have one for each? Yeah, oh, thank you. Thanks. The shorter one is the outline of what I was thinking if we could talk through. And then the longer one is a bunch of quotes from Kant's works that we can go to as we go through the plan. And so I don't know if that's okay as far as a general setup. The only thing that's missing is, while you were away, everyone introduced themselves and said a little bit, like 2 or 3 sentences about their interests and their research, and then also if they have any connection to Kant already. So I don't know if you could share a little bit.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm a professor of modern philosophy.
Yes.
And I research French modernism. The old, the back, the side.
Yes. Okay. They reported this and they got it exactly right. So, and I don't know if maybe one sentence about, is there a project you're working on that might have any connection or relation to debates about idealism, or is it just materialism? Yeah, okay. So the other way, yeah. So that's the other thing is, and you were bringing this up yourself, Antonio, that Kant in the history of philosophy, if you think, oh, the history of idealism, Plato, maybe some people before Plato. If you're sensitive to the history of medieval philosophy, maybe some of the Neoplatonists and some Christian thinkers understood a certain way. And then if you skip a while, then it's like George Berkeley, Kant, and maybe for some people it's like really just like Plato and Kant are the only two big idealists. And so one of the interests in interpreting, in the agreed upon history of philosophy, and then after that, it's, well, Hegel is an idealist for some people, for other people, he is a spiritualist, or he's really just almost like Marx, and then after Hegel, no one wants to talk about idealism in the same way. It's like just drops off as a label that you apply to yourself with pride. And I think a lot of it is in the interest of, well, but there's got to be something true about materialism or naturalism or who knows what. And so there's a little bit of like sheepishness or concern or not quite shame, but well, could idealism still mean something or be true? And so I think I'm pro at least trying to see if idealism could be true. I don't know if it's true, but I don't feel like the arguments against it or the impulses to dissolve it are compelling enough to give up. So that's part of this is, with all of the history of idealism, I just think there's something that all of the historical iterations of idealism have inside of their spirit as philosophers, that there's something true there, and there's no chance of just letting it go and not talking about it or ignoring it. And so how to fold it into a unified understanding or comprehension of the world, it's very hard, of course. I mean, they all admit that's very hard, but there's something here that they have an impulse. And so part of the interest in thinking through Kant today together will be, what is the view that's even there? In what sense is it idealism? And then how does it seem to connect with our ordinary understanding of things and also more recent understandings in philosophy or science or psychology? So that's some of the background motivations or whatever for my interest in Kant, my continuing interest in Kant, and the legacy of Kant, but also the broader history of idealism. So I don't know, maybe just to talk about the order of how we could talk together. So there's a long abstract, which I won't, maybe I can read in a second, but the main plan would be talking a little bit about the way people talk about Kant usually and the idealism, and then my suggestion for a particular intervention in the general discussion, and then moving from that setup to looking just at some text from Kant and trying to read through and see what are the pieces and where are the distinctions, and when we do the X-ray just right and cut things and align them, what's the picture that results? And so that is section 2, and in some ways I think will be maybe the main section for our group. And then I included more things after, which if we have time and if people have energy and interest and stamina, we could keep going onto those topics, because in some ways it's really in section 2 sets up the question of what about this other term, nature? And then section 3 is supposed to look at some more texts where he talks about what does nature mean for him and in what way is it connected with idealism in general. And so for people who are interested in a more materialist-friendly dimension of Kant, I think having a conception of what he might mean by nature that includes something that's not just ideal is important. And so that would be sections 3 and 4, trying to make more precise in what way does nature have a meaning for Kant and where does it fit within the general scheme of his idealism. And then section 5, maybe it will be too much into the Kant research weeds, where I try to say, oh, if we understand it this way, it relates to these other interpretations in that way, or there's even more esoteric parts of the Kant's writings where he uses these other terms, and how does it relate? So maybe we can get to there, and if people, I know some people who have worked on Kant will get to that. Yeah, that we can talk after at lunch or something, or over a beer. But for our group, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. So that's the general plan, I guess. I don't know if that sounds okay. And then, and I really, if we, as we get especially into the text part, if people can ask questions or make comments. I was already talking with Klaus about the translations from in the Portuguese that I could find online from the pirates. Only some of them have, the text as searchable and copy-pastable. And so I know, as in all the languages, and even in German, there's preferred editions and then preferred translations of those editions. And then, did I pick the right ones? My sense is the ones that I picked are at least passable as translations, and so they'll allow people who aren't sophisticated in their understanding of English or German to still be able to be part of the conversation. I hope, that's my hope. And then, but that could also be another set of questions: is in what way does the translations, do they match, and does the same impression come out when you read it in another language? Or so happy also to have that kind of conversation too. So so that's the general plan for the more specific, like what are we actually going to do, and then just a little bit about the even more specific debate. And so I think with Plato and Kant, if there is some sense that there's a realm or some world that's called the realm of appearances, and something having to do with a distinction between that and the realm of things or truths or reality in some sense of reality, and what are the motivations for thinking there would be these two realms, and then what are the options for understanding how they would relate to each other. So that general question is as old as Plato or even older, and Kant has been taken to contribute to that debate in a very specific way, that the sense of appearance that he works with is something that is connected especially to the human subjectivity, and especially not just the subjectivity in general, but the dimension of the subjectivity that's in relation to the process of cognition, and even more specifically, the dimension of the human subjectivity that's related to the process of cognition as to the sensing part. And so the whole discussion of what an appearance is and why we would be motivated to identify certain items as appearances is placed within this broader context of a theory of cognition for humans. And so that's one piece of Kant's idealism, or his approach to appearances in particular at least. But then there's a whole separate part of the position which isn't so much about the theory of cognition, although it relates to it, but it's more just about the background assumptions about ontology or metaphysics, that beyond whatever appearances might be, Kant also, when he presents the whole view of his theory of cognition, assumes, or seems to, that there are things which aren't appearances. Of course, at the very least, there's the faculties or powers of the mind that get appearances and look at them and do things to them. And the powers aren't just more appearances, they're real in some other sense, they're activities. And so that's one place where the motivation for just talking about things which are not appearances but relate to appearances. So that's one immediate motivation, is just within the theory of cognition itself, that not all of the happening or makeup of cognition is just more appearance. And so that's a simple motivation. But then in a way that's, I think, closer to the older traditions and idealism, Kant also just talks as if, yes, the appearances that we're talking about in our processing of cognition are related to the things. That's how we get them, is things affect these forces and powers in us, and appearances come out of that interaction, and there are appearances, and that's the way in which we cognize, is by using appearances. But there's also the things, and we wouldn't really be able to even think about these items in our processing of cognition as appearances, given the features that we give to them, or think about them as having, if we didn't also connect them to things in some way. And so that's at least my own impression of reading into Kant, that he seems to just take all that for granted, that there will be, the discourse about appearances and things is as old as time, and he doesn't mean to be canceling the discourse, but he means to be clarifying what is the sense of appearance and what is the sense of thing, and how does it work as a picture. And the leading approach to what an appearance is goes through the theory of cognition, and the general background commitment to there still being things that relate to the appearances relates to the theory of cognition, but it's also just a kind of ordinary presupposition in some way. And so in the interpretation of Kant, depending on why you are interested in Kant, and maybe you have other philosophical interests that you want to bring to Kant, different people have proposed different understandings of what an appearance is and what a thing is for Kant and how do they relate. And so in the tradition, I think the most common way of understanding the distinction is they're really distinct. One is something subjective and one is the real things that there are. And there is some relation, but it's not clear exactly what it will be. Something having to do with dependence or grounding, because these cause the appearances in us. But as we'll see in the quotes, Kant is very clear in lots of places that he doesn't think we ever just get the things somehow in our minds. It's always by way of the appearances, except for maybe in the case of our own subjective activities, which we can talk about as we go. And so there's epistemological questions about how do we know which things, and how do we know the relation between the two, and with what right would we say there's a thing versus another thing. Those are all good questions, but that there are things in some general sense, and that there is a relation between the two, I think most people take that for granted nowadays. There were some very speculative interpretations of Kant in the 19th century, which saw in Kant the possibility of getting rid of the idea of a thing and becoming even more pure appearance theorists or phenomenalists in some other sense. I don't think people nowadays think of that as like, that's the basic way you should approach Kant. It might turn out he should have said that, but he didn't say that. That's, at least I think that much is taken for granted in some way. But then how do you characterize the distinction that he has made and the relation? And so one impulse is to say, well, the appearances form their own whole world, and things form their whole world, and there's some relation between the two. But the ontological questions aren't as interesting. What's really interesting are the epistemological questions, or the theory of cognition. And if we combine the basic theory of cognition with the ontology, and then we say something like, yeah, and so the only cognitions we can have, the way cognition works in general, is to process by way of appearances and judge about things. All of our cognition is restricted in some sense to a dependence through appearances. And I think also people think there's some kind of truth in that way of presenting Kant. Then I think a lot of the interesting discussions have arisen as to, well, what would it be to talk about things on the one hand, and is there any way to cognize, or through our processes of cognition, to relate to things? I mean, it's a background presupposition that we can think about them or something, but can we know anything, like even know that they exist, or know that they are the grounds of the appearances, or know that they are distinct from appearances? Aren't those all knowledge claims, and should we count those as cognitions? So that's one set of questions. But the other set of questions is, well, what about the things that we ordinarily seem to experience in our everyday lives, like the chairs and the tables and the persons and the coffee, and what does Kant say about those? And then we kind of point. And so then it's a question in the second group of questions when we say, oh, like this, is that an appearance or a thing for Kant, if those are the two worlds? And that is really where the discussion that I'm hoping we can have will be. So of course, there could be interesting debates about what is an appearance and what is a thing. And in some ways, the discussion that we'll be talking through will implicate all of those questions too. But the orientation of the question is, well, okay, interesting idea that there are appearances, interesting idea that there are things, interesting general setup, and then what everyone I think is more interested in figuring out is, well, the system, but then also what should we say just about the ordinary objects of experience? Are they appearances or are they things? And so what we'll see is one of the terms Kant uses for the realm of the objects of experience is nature. And so then if we now just re-ask the question, what is nature? Is it appearance? Is it a collection of appearances? Is it things? Is it a collection of things? Or something else? That's the space of the discussion that we will have. And so nature in particular as a concept that's coordinate with the domain of the objects of our ordinary experience, what is it, ontologically speaking? And so that's the general question. And then, I think in the history of idealism, and this is why I think for the people who are interested in materialist approaches or naturalist approaches, this is really a core question, because if you think, well, however idealist you might be, if you can't give an account of the reality of nature or the materiality of nature or and human nature in particular also, then it seems like the view is not going to go very far. And so on some interpretations of Kant, the way of talking about nature can make it sound very idealist in this particular sense, that all of nature is a collection of appearances, and there's no things there really, and that can sound very revolutionary and strange and also impossible as to believe. But maybe that's Kant's insight, is philosophy and its reflection. It really is, it should say, once we make this distinction, all of nature falls on this side and not on the side of things. And so in the interpretation of Kant, that tradition of interpreting nature as if it is a part of or the whole of the realm of appearances is one track of interpreting Kant. And so in the world of appearances and the world of things, if we ask where is nature, one track is to say, oh, it's in the appearance side. A different approach, which especially was developed in, maybe the late 20th century, in English language at least, wants to resist that and say, no, nature, it has to involve things somehow. I mean, it can't just be appearances. And what are the motivations? Well, some are just the ordinary sense of like, what would it mean to say all of this is not a thing, it's just an appearance, even though it has to have some relation to appearances. And so on the second track, there's the just general question of how should we talk about nature? Is it possible when we look back at Kant's text to see him talking about nature and really talking about things rather than just appearances? And so the presentation here will be a way of describing it is exploring the second option and then trying to clarify what I think is probably right, that when Kant is talking about nature, he really does mean to be talking about something that's more than the appearances, although it relates to appearances or it maybe even includes them in some sense. But how should we put the grammatical forms of the sentences to describe nature? And so what I'll show here is when people have talked about Kant on nature, there has been some assumptions about the talking about Kant on nature that force them to say certain things about nature for Kant. And what I'm hoping is through this kind of investigation, we could undo some of these original assumptions such that there'll be more options for how to talk about Kant and his views on nature in particular. So, okay, I don't know, that's a lot of setup, but I'm hoping just to bring everyone into the same conversation space. So with that, now we can just move through the plan, if that's okay. Okay, so in section 1, so the way in which people have talked about Kant's metaphysics or idealism in general, there's one assumption that's common, I think, to most interpreters, that there is a distinction between appearances and things in themselves, the way that they are in themselves, and that this distinction is exclusive, so nothing is an appearance that is a thing in itself, and nothing is a thing in the way it is in itself and an appearance. And it's also exhaustive, that for any x you can ask, is it an appearance or is it a thing in itself? And so then you can tell, like, if you ask that about nature and there's this exclusive sorting, what's the answer supposed to be? And I think what nature is for Kant is composed wholly of appearances is kind of the default assumption that we have to say that for some reason because Kant talks about nature as relating to appearances and including appearances. And some sentences it can look like he just says nature is the realm of appearances or the sum total of appearances. And if you just took those sentences out of context, that would be the answer. And so what I want to do is to rethink these assumptions in part by just looking at texts where he talks about nature and making sure we add more text than just the ones where he says very quickly that it relates to appearances. But what else does he say? And then systematically, does that imply, so my own challenge to the second one is that nature can't just include appearances, it also has to include things. And in particular, it has to include the things that cause appearances, and it has to include the things that cause appearances in the relation to the appearances. And that will be the burden of looking at some text where Kant will just say nature is a term that includes not just appearance, but the causes and the existences and things. And so then that also forces us to rethink the exclusive, exhaustive distinction between appearance and thing, such that what nature is will be this third type of object or entity where he's using it to name things in relation to appearances, where it's neither just the thing nor just the appearance, but some dynamical connection between the two. And so we should call this a third kind of object, which part of the textual situation could be explained by Kant trying to find ways to talk about this object that's a relational structure. And it would motivate why he would want to insist that it has one anchor with appearances, but why he would never rest content or be satisfied with describing it as just appearance. And so that's the general shape of the investigation and its results. And so then in the rest of the time, that's what I was suggesting, is to try to build towards that way of understanding what Kant means by nature, is that we would just look at some texts and talk about them, and I could tell you how I'm seeing them, and then you can check and ask questions or comments, and then we can just see how far we get, and if we get all the way to nature and the whole picture, that's great. If not, then we can take a break and go get beers or I don't know, whatever, coffee. So does that sound okay? And also, are there any initial already things you want to ask about, or does it feel like you feel equipped to go forward now? Okay. So, and I do need help because this is, I'm trying to develop this interpretation, and I see the importance of it, and I also see the way of presenting it as trying to be ecumenical or conciliatory across ways that people talk about Kant. And so, and the other motivation in some ways is to try to make Kant seem less like he's starting from a position that's very hard to defend, and more like he's starting from a position that is not so strange and weird. And so then, and it makes him much more continuous with research in psychology and cognitive science in the 19th and 20th century, that the kinds of things he says, people say today, the neo-Kantians said, every generation after said this kind of version of reality must be how it is. And so it domesticates, in that sense, Kant, that it brings him closer to home and makes it less, it makes it a challenge then to say, what are his insights in the way that are supposed to be revolutionary? But depending on your philosophical sensibility, if you are thinking the deepest, oldest truths, you don't need to be revolutionary about. You need to just care for them and maybe open them further, but to reinvent everything, how could that really be the truth? Reinventing some things maybe, and so this does make Kant less revolutionary in that sense and more fit in a kind of perennial philosophical tradition as to his commitments, not just his questions. So that's some background also. So if it turns out, Kant is really just like Plato and just like, that's okay. I would be happy if he was like, he's at least as smart as Plato or something. So anyways, that's the background motivation. But yeah, so then if we jump in, so what is this puzzle? And so, with the background hopefully now fresh in mind that these kinds of questions arise when you read Kant, and people have very strong views about how to sort appearance and thing, and nature is kind of a difficult, at least just test case for how people are sorting. What are some pressures from thinking about Kant where when he says he's talking about idealism, and then we ask, what do you mean by idealism? And then he says, this is what I mean by idealism. How does he talk about nature? And so the passage that I wanted to start with is the first 8 passages are all from this short work called The Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. So it's notes to get started when you're about to do metaphysics. You need to think about these things first. And so this is in a part of the work where he is talking about idealism explicitly. And I was just thinking we could see how he understands idealism of a certain kind, and then already in number 2, he rejects it. And so that's also complicated for people who really want him to be an extreme radical idealist. And then what we're tracking, of course, is the topic of objects that are like the objects that we might have normally thought were in nature in some sense. What is he saying about those and in this context? So maybe we just read through them, and then I have little sentences that are coordinate with content from the passages. But so in the first one, he describes idealism as the claim that there are none other than thinking beings, and that the other things that we believe we perceive in our intuitions or through our intuitions are only representations, and there's no object that really corresponds to them outside. And so some of this language I have under 2.1. So idealism consists in, there is a distinction between appearance or representation or something in representations and thing, but the only kinds of things there are thinking beings, and all the other objects or seeming objects are representations or just parts of representations, and there's no objects that correspond to or are outside of these representations. So that's the A through C under 2.1. And then immediately in this context, Kant, you could think that's what some people might think he himself really believes. And so then what does he say? Well, I say in opposition, or I say against this. There are things given to us as objects of the senses existing outside of us. We know nothing about how they are in themselves, and we're only acquainted with their appearances, but these appearances are representations they produce in us, because they, not the appearances, but the things, affect our senses. And so, and then, number 3, it gets even more affirmative. Not just against that, but pro this other thing, admitto, or there are bodies outside of us. There are things, though we don't know how they are in themselves, they are the things that influence us and produce representations, and then we give them the name body. Even though that signifies something about the appearance of this object, it still, in the pointing, keeps going to a thing, the thing that influences us and gives us these representations. So my sense here, and as he says in number 4, is this idealism, it's the very opposite of it. Is he just really means this, that if by idealism you meant this very extreme thing, that not that there's no distinction between representations and things, there might be, or there is, but the only things there are the things, the faculties, the thing that has the faculties to have the appearances or representations, and in the appearances or representations, if those point to some other object, we don't affirm that any of those other objects exist, that all we are really affirming is the being that thinks and the thinking contents, and everything that might be outside of it we say no to. That's the idealism he's talking about, and he is saying he affirms the very opposite of it. And the example is the one that we're interested in. It's the example of representations that relate to objects that are outside of thinking beings, that are given to us with sensing, and the language of body is the language of nature. So this is, if you were trying to get motivation for the kind of position.
It's unable to define the, it's not matter, nature.
So nature will be body, and in that sense, body is defined as having material being constituted by matter. So the language of body, or körper, is really the language of material relating to space and existing across time and having powers.
It's an idealist.
Well, that's what he's saying. By body, we are pointing to the thing, not just to the representation. Yeah, and so that's why, and it's in a work that is short, and it's introductory, and this is not far into the pages. And so if your introduction to Kant was by reading this book and you get to this page, you think, okay, yeah, he must believe there are things. And the things that he's talking about that he believes that there are the ones that connect to our sensing and our experience in that sense. And the ones we call bodies, those are the things. And yes, he has all these qualifications about we don't know what it is in itself and whatever, but and so the way I put it here, his position is he agrees there are sensory representations in thinking beings, and by implication, thinking beings exist, that's there. But he denies that the objects corresponding to and outside of sensory representations don't exist. So he affirms they do exist. They actually exist, they're real. And by what we mean by body is we're pointing to that. And so, yes, in D&E there are epistemological further qualifications. We don't know what these things are in themselves. We're acquainted only with the appearances, with the representations of them. But these representations are produced by those things that we're calling bodies. And a lot of the stuff that we say about them, maybe we're not always careful, and we're going to say something about, we're going to have to clarify when we say body and we mean this aspect, do we mean more something that is a part of how we are sensing them versus when we're trying to judge about them, and so there'll be clarification that has to be made. But the general idea that when we're judging and thinking, we mean to point to a thing that is outside of the representations, that seems, at least from these passages, fairly straightforward, that he's affirming all of that.
They're reliable information.
Well, how we know and with what right, those are good questions. The main point here is just he is avowing. And so the language is fairly clear. He denies, idealism consists in this, and then yo afirmo ao contrario, and then the next one, com isto admito, por tanto, and the German is that. I say against that, and then so I affirm, therefore. And so do we have to explain it away? We could feel like, how could he be saying this? We know all this other stuff about Kant must be true. My strategy here in the group is to say, well, let's start with this and see, could he just really mean it? And then what pressures would there be to have us ever take this away? And I think there are never pressures enough to have him deny this. It's just, he really believes this. So, and then, we can keep going. Number 6. Number 5. So yes, there are some things that we want to say when we think it through. What we really mean to be talking about is the way, or the representation that the thing causes in us. It has certain features. And so in that sense, those features are really pertaining to the appearance or the representation of the thing and not the thing. But we can make that point, and then this first sentence in 5, without at all detracting from the actual existence of the outer thing. And the German, it's like actual existence of the outer thing. I don't know how the Portuguese, sin prejuízo, so without prejudice to the real existence, actual existence. So that's never in question. And then 6, the further clarification. My system cannot be called idealist, even though I'm talking about some of these features of the representation as belonging to an appearance. This has nothing to do with the existence of the thing that appears. That's not nullified. And so here, pois a existencia da coisa now, suprimido. So I guess, so that's, scene 1 or whatever. And in the next note in this very same part, he just keeps going, and he just, it's like if you missed it a few pages before, let me say it again. Here, what I called idealism in my own voice, it didn't mean that. And so in the section he also says, maybe I shouldn't say idealism in this way. It's just making people go in the wrong direction. What I called idealism in my own voice, now dice respecto a existencia da cosas. So it never came into my mind to doubt that. That's even stronger. It's not only like I affirm, it's like I never even meant to doubt the other thing. Huh?
Which number?
This is number 7.
Okay.
Yeah. Duvidar de la nunca me pasó pela mente. And so, in 8, so I totally grant actuality to these things. And so my protestation against all of the idealism of the other sense is clear. But then we finally get him using the term that we want. I'm not, in this way, ascribing any kind of illusion to nature. So, en tal não veo na natureza nenhuma ilusão. So that more officially connects us to our topic, which is, okay, so then what is his doctrine of these things that he has not even entered his mind to doubt that they exist, and they're the things that influence our senses and cause these representations. And at the end of this description, he says, yeah, I don't mean to ascribe all of nature to an illusion, or all of our sense of nature as itself an illusion. So what's the theory of nature? And the setup, I hope it's clear, at least, that if you were reading just these texts, the impression could feel like obvious that he's saying he's not an idealist in this one sense. If he is an idealist at all, it's really just about the appearances stuff and the representations, but in no way does he mean to be denying this other thing. I don't know. Does it feel, are you willing at least to tick it on as like, okay, let's see where this goes? But yeah, okay. But I know, yes, yeah. Yeah.
Based on human being putting God from within into nature, to creating the universe. And I think about Bergmeister's reading on this question.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, in general, if what is at the very least clear is he in no way means to be saying all there are appearances. There have to be at least thinking beings. And then he is also saying there's another kind of being that's outside of the representations that we're pointing at, and I'm not denying that those exist. And then we could still ask, like, oh, okay, but is there some deeper ground for both? Like, is there a divine ground that creates the thinking being and creates the other thing? And maybe there's, in that sense, the divine activity is guided by ideas, and so there's a deeper idealism. Maybe, I mean, that's all fine, but that's not what he's talking about here. It's just this very simple, smaller circuit. And in that relation of idealism, it's just all denied. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question, but perhaps if it's better to answer afterwards.
We can see. I mean, so the next section is just, okay, what does nature mean?
Yeah,
and
it leads to this first quote.
Yeah.
The rest.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So far, in all instances, you take things to refer directly to the things in themselves, right? Because I was going to ask, because I didn't spot it, if you discuss A114, the passage about the Hogan, because it seems like instead of an idealist conception, a more idealist, Kant would say that what Kant does is rethink the conception of thing as something instituted by laws. And since the understanding is the faculty that.
Right, yeah, so we'll get to that. That's a further kind of question. The main thing is just that there are things in this sense that he's talking about, they're distinct from the representations. And he doesn't mean to deny that there are things in this whatever sense that exist and have real existence and actual existence. We can still ask, like with the divine question, like, what's the cause of those things? And if it turns out to be another mind or spirit or thinking being, we might wonder about the broader context of idealism. If it turns out that those things exist because our minds cause them, even if not the representations that are sensory, that would also be a different kind of idealism. But we haven't gotten there either. Right now, we just have these very, what I think of as straightforward, and he's not saying like, but just keep reading, like, and I'm gonna cancel it. It's like, no, like, by no means, I didn't even enter my mind, you know. And so, anyways, at least to get started, and then, you know, the next round will be, okay, but don't we know he's got to be more idealist than this, and he has something else, you know, what's in his sleeve? It's going to be like, well, I said actual thing out there, outside of representations, but I didn't really mean it, you got me, like, but I don't think he ever does that, so yeah, so the setup is to try to invite you to, you know, feel like it's safe here, he's not going to take it away, and then be ready to see, just keep working, and then when you would have to make a choice, if it's always an option to stay with this kind of simple view, then you'd have to have other motivations to go with the other view. And so, yeah, I don't know. But if we now see nature was named, and now we see, okay, so what does he say about nature then when he's not introducing his position and clarifying, but when he's trying to do the systematic construction of what do we mean by nature given all the other things that we know. And so this is section 3. Oh, and 2.3, it's the thing we've already talked about, like naming nature and the body and things outside of us. It creates this dilemma for the original assumptions, the people who really want to hold these original assumptions for Kant. And in a way, we're starting off not by making those assumptions and letting his own voice tell us what he means by idealism and appearance and thing. And so then we don't have to believe in these assumptions, we're trying to keep connection with why, if you had these assumptions, you could feel troubled by what he says about nature. And so anyways, that's 2.3 is more just that, like, if you already had these assumptions, why are these comments puzzling, or at least raise a puzzle? So then when he talks about nature itself, so this is quotes 9 through 15, there's a lot of quotes, but they're shorter. What does he say? And so if you were thinking like, well, if nature is supposed to be somehow related to our appearances, we know that the bodies influence our minds and make up representations. He's conceding that, like what we're talking about goes through the representation that they bring about in us, and so he will probably say something about nature is related to these sensory representations. But what we just also want to keep track of is he's always saying, and it's about the things, and not just the representations. So here's in the same prolegomena, the next section, he talks about, okay, what is nature? The first sentence of it is, nature is the existence of things. And so not appearances or nothing about representations at all. It's just things. And then as we go on, what more does it mean than just existence? This is something that Pedro is starting to allude to. In 10, well, it's existence of things insofar as the existence is determined by laws or structured by laws. And when we place something in nature, we're saying it's a part of this existence of things in general that's structured by law. So that's quote 10. And again, it doesn't say anything about representations. It's just about a kind of existence. So, and again, if you're thinking like, well, yeah, so ontologically speaking, would we say something is in nature if it had no lawful connection to whatever else existed at all? Maybe, I don't know. But it's a very simple point. I mean, so this is all just, again, poisoning the well. So you're like, how could you think otherwise? And this is Kant's words. And then he does also make the connection in number 11, not just to the existence of things and the structure by law, but it's really supposed to be these objects that we're experiencing. And so nature, considered materially, is the sum total of all objects of experience.
We could, in a sense, perceive things
without establishing laws about them.
Maybe, I don't know.
Maybe, I don't know.
But we might not say they're in nature.
Uh-huh.
So like your dream world might have some kinds of objects that exist in some sense, but if you can't connect them through law, then you won't have a ground for saying they're in nature. So if you're thinking in this like criterial sense, it's a principle of ontology that it has to exist in a lawful way, but the principle gives us a kind of clue or criterion for judging about things that, well, if we can't see any lawful connection between its seeming existence and anything else, we will hesitate to put it in nature. We'll put it somewhere else, like in the dream world or in a fictional world. Or so yeah, but and that it's supposed to connect to experience. Again, nature, number 11, and then number 12, putting them together. It's the existence under law of the objects of experience, and so. One thing just to note here is, and just the questions were already bringing this out, there's no assertion that everything is in nature, and so that's the illusion on number 11. If there were objects that could not be objects of experience, we would call them not in nature, they're hyperphysical. And so there it's a kind of closing off of the sense that we're giving to nature. It's not so broad that it's anything that exists in lawful connection with anything else. We have a broader concept that would include more than nature in that sense, and he's thinking, at least as a thought, there could be the divine, or there could be who knows what, which we don't want to put the divine in nature, and so there might be other objects that stand in law-governed relations to others in existence. So we need a little bit more specificity than just existence in relation to law. And so the connection to experience is another criterion of when we say something is natural or in nature, it has to be the kind of thing that can connect to our experience of it, of things. If something can't be an object of experience, we'll call it hyperphysical, we won't put it in nature. Maybe there are no such things, but we at least want to keep track of, we're adding that in a presupposition about what nature means. And so that makes it not just, there's nature, we haven't talked about representations yet. When we do talk about representations, we talk about experience, and then we say the coordination of our experience with objects, that's the space we're talking about with nature. Where does this go? Well, why would people have ever thought then that nature is appearances? I mean, it's like, and so you can see the door opening with the connection to experience that, and even before that, the objects in nature make representations in us, and their sensory representations, their intuitions, their appearances. We can use all the language. And then here, and if an object doesn't connect in that way to our mental representations, if it can't be an object that brings those about, and then we have an experience with it, we won't say it's in nature. So those are a couple of steps that way. But we never see the further thesis that and all the thing is in nature that we're talking about is the representation stuff. And that last step is the one we would need if we want this other kind of view that nature is just something, appearance or whatever. And so what I want to bring out is when he's trying to talk carefully about what nature is, and he includes things having to do with appearance, he always adds, it's not just the appearance, it's the existence thing, the thing. And so there's a technical use of existence throughout this part of, now we're moving to the Critique of Pure Reason, the bigger book. So here in number 13, nature, yes, it's related to appearances, but when we're talking about just appearances, we actually won't say nature. We'll talk about a whole that can be determined mathematically, but it's not yet nature. So that's an interesting point. And they could be called the world of appearances. But when we say nature, we mean something else. And so this is in quote 13. It's called nature once we add to it a dynamism. So not just aggregation of material or something in a mathematically displayed sense, but existence, where you have to make that further thesis, the existence relating to appearances. And this, when you are on the lookout for this, it just keeps showing up. So it's never just appearances, it's always appearances in regard to their existence. So that's quote 14. Quote 15, appearances in relation to a principle of causality. And again, if you are already assuming, oh, but he must mean somehow like it's the existence of the appearance itself, or it's the cause that's somehow in the appearance itself, maybe if you had started from that kind of presupposition, you could try to make that kind of reading work. But the way that we've been introduced, it just seems much clearer that he just means to keep referring to the existence of the things, the causality from the things that relate to the appearances. And you're thinking of the thing in relation to the representation that it causes, and the existent thing, where you're never canceling the existence of the thing. And I don't know. So that's, at least the spirit of it is, at least not yet anything that would force the further, more radical conception of nature. And so then, just to make the final point about this all being what is dynamical, and so the technical term for Kant, where when we say nature, we mean not just a display that could be thought of mathematically, because maybe that could just be something about our representations. We really mean existence of things with causes and substances and the thinginess, materiality, all that kind of stuff in the force sense. And the general name for it, to signal that we're moving from wondering or inspecting our representations to judging about these things, is we're moving from what we might be doing just mathematically in relation to our representations. You could do that in dreams or whatever, imagination, to the judgment about the thing. We have to use all of these categories that are called dynamical. And so in his system, he has this division of the categories. So number 16 and 17 bring this out a little bit. Some of the categories, when we think about what we can think about, will be concerned with the intuition or the representations. But some other ones we use when we want to talk about the existence. The first ones are the mathematical, the second ones are the dynamical. And so the dynamical ones are the ones that are directed at the existence of the objects. And in 17 also, the mathematical ones, when we apply them more immediately to intuitions, the representations. The dynamical ones we apply to the existence of in relation to the appearance. And so why, again, does it have to be read this way? If you start from the other assumptions, you could try to give a different reading that would begin with that this has to only be talking about appearances. And the grammar is such that if you already have that assumption, it's not impossible to try to work that as the position that he's trying to hold. But then when you hit these other passages, like the ones we started with, it just feels very jarring. Like he should never say that. And especially when he says, like, it never entered my mind. It's like, but you're being totally disingenuous, because we know you've been saying this whole time, and in this big book for many pages, and now you're saying you never even thought of it. This kind of approach, I think, just makes him not be more demonic or something, or like a liar or something, or being mischievous. It's just, he really just means it. I didn't mean to doubt any of that stuff. You just had to be keeping track of these further technical terms and the markings with existence, dynamism, cause, all that stuff. And so one other just technical thing to note is in 4.2, this distinction between in experience when we are relating to nature, that we're bringing to bear these concepts of the existence of a thing, the cause in things, the substantiality and materiality of things that relate to our appearances. It's a different kind of cognitive act than just having a sensory representation in mind. And that Kant marks systematically, terminologically, this distinction as well, that having a representation that's caused by a thing in our mind is one thing, that's an intuition. We can even become conscious of that representation. That's what he calls perception or Wahrnehmung. But then there's this next step in the cognitive processing, which is judging about the thing that is not the representation and that we affirm and never mean to cancel. And we can't ever know it in itself, but what we're doing is connecting the appearance to the thing that brought it about. And when we do that last thing, we're not just having an appearance in an intuition or becoming conscious of it in perception, But that's what we really mean when we use the term experience in the sense that connects to nature, is we judge about things and we mean the things. So the technical terms, this is an 18, is a nice place.
When we say judge, we mean like this is the thing.
So the language is determining an object, yeah. So like the chair is there, or the chair is there again, or I don't know, like simple judgments of the objects in nature and experience. So just to have marked the distinction, because this is a point in interpretation where even people who have been reading Kant a while, especially in other languages, but even in German, don't always mark this technical distinction between intuition, perception, and experience. And so sometimes they'll think, oh, he says experience, he really just means intuition, or vice versa. But when you're onto this system, and especially if you're wanting to make sure there isn't a bunch of sliding that happens interpretively on some of these exact points, this distinction tracks, I think, in an important way, the distinction between the representation and having it and the going to the thing. And so the intuition and then becoming conscious of it in perception is on the one side, and experience, in the way that we usually use the term, it really is the going to the thing. It's not just staying with something in our minds. And so this also lets us have just a more, in that sense, realist understanding of the objects of experience, that they're the objects in nature, they're the things that we thought they were, and they're not something in us. Like, that, what would that even mean? So in 18, there's a series of quotes where I just mark the distinction. So experience is a kind of cognition, a determining of an object. It does it through perceptions. What's perception? Perception is consciousness of an appearance. Those are the objects of perception. And so experience is a determining of an object through that to something else. And the intuition is just having it, and you have to become conscious of it to even have perception. But then the cognition of the object through the perception is still some further thing. So that's just for those of you who are interested in the terminology of the period. And then tying it back together, the principles that constitute our experience, this is number 19, are not principles for mere appearances or intuition, but there really are this is the number 19, principles that concern existence. And it's like once you have it lit up, it's like he couldn't have said it many more times clearer. But if you didn't have it lit up, you would just skim right over it and think, oh, he must be talking about the existence of the appearance, because what else would it be? Like, is there another option? But in the presentation now, we see there's an obvious other option, which is the existence of the thing that is related to the appearance. That's what we are judging about. That's what these principles are all about. So that's the main presentation. And then I included some other things in the last section just because I think, and maybe Pedro's question already is anticipating a little bit about this, that if you then wanted to say, okay, but what are these things which we're assuming now are distinct from the representations in us that are sensory, the appearances? They're not the thinking being itself. They're the objects of judgment and experience. They're what we place in nature. Okay, you convinced me he's not an idealist in some other sense. He believes all those things. But isn't there some other deeper idealism where like he really still is an idealist and he doesn't think they're really out there or something? And I guess that's the challenge where I want to say, no, there's no other understanding of idealism that he will affirm where he won't say, in relation to the sensory appearances that we have in our minds and we think about and are conscious of, in our experience, we're judging about a different object that is not identical to those and really is being judged as the ground of those, and it exists independently of these, and he doesn't mean to cancel the existence of that in anything he's saying. Stopping there, I feel like that's his view. And then if you wanted to ask about further, more sophisticated, deeper kinds of idealism, like Hegel or Plato or whoever, those are real questions, but they just never cancel this basic position. And so what's the source of the existence of the thing that's distinct, now we're assuming, from the appearance? It's the thing in nature. It has an existence. Its existence is determined by law. It's what we experience when we do the experiencing kind of mental activity. What is it? Can we say more? And where did it come from? And how does it relate to humanity? those are great questions, but those are further questions, not the first question. And so the last section in the quotes is a place where Kant talks a little bit about like, okay, yeah, so how are we thinking about these things? And we know we can think about them, and so, and as he says in one of the quotes, this is number 21, for example, the thing that's not what shows up in the sense itself, but the thing as it is in itself, it's not a contradictory concept. In fact, it's a necessary concept. And then in the middle of quote 20, after the last ... the doctrine of sensibility itself implies these thoughts about these things. But then he does seem to associate what the way we think about these things when we abstract from how they relate to us by influencing appearances showing up in us. He will call them objects of the understanding or the pure understanding. And so they're noumena, and he's associating it a little bit with Plato there. And so the way of framing the question is, he doesn't mean to deny they're there. He thinks it's not just a possible concept, but a necessary one to think that they're there. He doesn't mean to cancel or doubt. He does associate them with beings of the understanding, but again, if you started from this, you could think, oh, well, we know you can't know anything about those things, so he must be open to doubting or something. But our approach makes it clear, I think, that he doesn't really mean to doubt that they're there. It's like the concept is possible, it's necessary. The implication of the whole doctrine of appearances is that they are there. And we have to be careful how we think about them. We won't want to talk about them as if, when we're talking about them in this way, like what are they considered independently of how they cause appearances in us? We won't, again, say like, oh, well, they're the things that cause appearances in us because we're trying to abstract from that part of them. And so we will give a name to considering them that way. They're beings considered from the point of view of just thinking or the understanding, not sensing. But all of the existence claims are still all there, and so that's the main point at the end. So I know you had questions that are still underneath in the mechanics of like, what's underneath all of this stuff, even in a deeper way. But before we get to that, do people feel like there's, does the line of the interpretation, does it come out clearly enough? And do people feel like you can understand what the picture would be, whether you are convinced this is what Kant thinks, but just that there is a way to this kind of picture that through these texts it could feel like a possible picture. That's the goal, at least the minimal goal, is like there's something here to think about, and we can still criticize it, but is it an option? I don't know. Okay. But yes, and then, so now if there are questions or comments or,
I'll try to articulate it, but
yes.
It's not totally clear, right? But
Yes.
okay. So like in the very first quote you say of the concept, that no other than thinking things, all the things that we believe we perceive in intuition are only representation of thinking things to which in fact no object existing outside this thinking corresponds, right? The way I usually interpret Kant, and I would like you to contrast so I can understand your position better, is that like you have, it seems like in your position you go from appearance to the things in itself, right? When Kant says, these are appearances of things, you're making this jump directly to the thing in itself. But in the context of like Hume, etc., I would think that there's like three steps, right? There's the appearance, which is the unsynthesized intuitions, and what Kant calls an object, and when Kant says, I don't deny objects exist, he's making the anti-Humean claim that there are truly synthetic things in nature, but these are also appearances, because they are a synthesis. Like, so you have appearances in the unsynthesized or unconnected, or unconnected, because Hume, in a sense, denies that objects exist, insofar as we understand objects to be connected things, objectively connected things, right? You only see like the white and the black and the texture, but this does not make an object. An object would be one thing which is white, has this texture, etc. So it seems like, at least the way I usually read Kant, we have the appearance, and then the object as a synthesis of appearances, and then from this object we can talk about, oh, it's an appearance of the laptop. But the laptop is a synthesis made by the understanding already. And then from this thing I can point to the laptop, I can talk about the laptop in itself. But so perhaps just contrast this with what your position is, so I can try to grasp it better.
Yeah, no, it's a nice question, and so maybe the one way to bridge the way of approaching it that way and the way that I'm trying to develop it here would be to focus on the language of synthesis and what are the cognitive operations when there are these sensory representations. How many steps are there to get to the judgment and experience, and in what way, as the way that I was presenting it, when we make the judgment and experience, to have an experience, when we're having the experience, we bring concepts to bear, the categories that point to existence of things rather than just to the representations. And so the main issue will be that there will be two steps in the synthesis. One will be the noticing of the representations and its parts and connecting two representations to each other or keeping track of one. And that's all what he describes as synthesis that happens in relation to perceptions or the becoming aware or conscious of the representations. And so that will already be activity of holding together and putting together. And so in one sense, a synthesis, an object which is not just one appearance or another, but a connection of them will come about. But it will still be a stitching together of representations a certain way. And so the connection that he describes as obtaining in the synthesis in relation to perception is not yet an experience, and it's not yet using the concepts like there's a thing there that exists. It's connecting of feels or qualities, sensory qualities, and there's a consciousness of all that you can have. But the next synthesis is a different kind of synthesis. It's not a putting together of material which is all itself representation of the category being a representation or a part of a representation. It's moving to the other kind of object. And so it really is a transcending of perception to the thing. So it's a transcending of a consciousness of the representations and their qualitative features and differentiations and how they relate to each other and that they can be held together in this way or this way to the thing that is the X that relates to them. And so the introduction of the third thing, which is neither one representation or another or the combination of them, but some X that they are related to. So I want that to be a step that isn't just more putting this together. It's taking a different kind of step in the intentionality of the thought. And so, having set it up this way, it would be a step from appearance having to appearance consciousness, that consciousness could already involve synthetic activity of noticing in the visual field, for example, like white and brown next to each other, or the tactile field, harder versus softer after another. There's all the sensations in time and even space arranged visually or in auditory space. But all of that will be noticings and being conscious and holding things together. But then it's just a different cognitive act when you are saying, these are all of an act. These are of something. And so the thing concept only comes in with the concept of, or the activity of experience. And so there will be synthesis that happens even in the noticings and perception. And then there will also be a synthesis when you make the connection to the thing. But connecting a bunch of representations as all of a thing is a different kind of synthesis. It's like a different order. And so that's and so one just textual hook is when Kant is allowing that mathematical syntheses and reasoning and decomposition and composition could happen, even within the field of it could just be representations that we're looking at. What's different when we take a different kind of cognitive act is determining something as a nature. It's a different kind of synthesis. It's using dynamical categories and principles that, as he says, don't apply to intuition, but apply to existence or the thing. So the scaffolding for the different kind of difference that I want to introduce. When you have experience rather than just consciousness of a representation, the dynamical concepts are employed and the principles are used. It really is supposed to be in the intentional ray that you're pointing at. You're pointing just at a different kind of thing. You're no longer pointing at the representation and noticing features about it or its connection with another one. So an appearance, another appearance, them together, one after another. But you're saying of those or judging of those, oh, those are of a thing, an X.
Yeah. It's interesting.
So
if you could say a bit more about this difference, because I would imagine that the synthesis itself already establishes the intentional object to the extent that there's nothing else to be in an object other than being a synthesis of representation.
well, right, so that's the difference that there has to be in kind, because already I can have, as an object of consciousness, one appearance or its parts, and then a second appearance, and then I can put them together in a synthesis, and that establishes a new object, the two appearances in a relation to each other. But it's still all in the subjective layer where I'm noticing the one after another in my flow of time of my representations. And so there has to be, this is why there has to be the staging, there would be one group of synthetic acts which would create new objects of consciousness, which are not just one appearance or one sensation, but a manifold of them relating to each other, but to each other. And that could be the synthesis of an apprehension or a retention or reproduction, where all the relata in the connectings are just more representations. And that's very friendly to Hume. It's like, yeah, you have an impression and another one, you notice one after another, you notice this one always comes after that one, and you start having kind of images of the way your impressions go together. But then there's just a different act, which is having that happen and judging, oh, there's a thing there that is causing the red after the blue after or there's a thing there that is causing the impression of impenetrability of this degree and then a little bit lower and then a little bit higher, and it's not just the sensation after another or these together, and I'm just keep looking at the representations, but I'm in my thought targeting something else. And there's no way to have that something else just be more of the putting representations together, even though that is a second object over and against one representation. It's still not this third thing, which is the X. So that's at least the machinery goes in that direction. And you know, aside from having these other assumptions ahead of time about, but it just has to either be an appearance or the thing in itself, and we can't even barely think those things, or how could we connect them? And this seems to bring things more into experience and nature than anyone feels, or some people feel it makes them very uncomfortable because it's supposed to be mysterious what these things are. And you know, you can say exactly what Kant says is, well, how they are in complete independence from how they relate to our sensing. Yeah, I mean, we can't think very much about that, but in no way does that mean we have to cancel the fact that in my experience I'm judging about things of the same kind. And so the other category that is worth, this is why I brought the phenomena noumena quotes, is if we're thinking of these things independently or abstracting from the way they cause sensations and appearances in us, but still keeping in thought that these are the things we experience. And so it's by definition, those are the things we're thinking about. And we peel away the way they cause sensations in us and the appearances and how we get to them through that, but we still hold them fixed in thought. He does want to say, yeah, we're thinking about them as beings approached from the pure understanding, but we're not positing new things. It's not a positive inflation of how things might be. It's just the same things, but it's a negative conception of the very same things. That's how I'm understanding the noumenon in a negative sense. There is a whole other kind of thought we could do, which is think about a thing that has no connection to what we sense or how we appear, how things show up in our minds in the sensory way, and we just jump to the object and we think of it and we think it could have a way that it is in itself. And that would be a positing of or an inflation of things, because we're going beyond the ones that we're agreeing are there because that we experience them, and we're thinking about other ones which we can't know in the same way if they're even there, but we could point to them in thought. It's okay, but that's a noumenon being approached from the pure understanding, but in a positing way. These we're not positing because we already experienced them, like they're just there. So that's, and then it really does place the objects in nature in the same general domain that they have a noumenal aspect to them, or they are beings that can be approached from the pure understanding. But there's no question about their existence. It's like, that's just there, in the way that the first quotes had it, that in no way did I ever mean to doubt that the things are there. But yeah, do you get the hang of it? That it's like, and so I appreciate that, like, if you had some of the assumptions from the beginning or other ones, and you thought, but Kant had to have this other kind of view, it's kind of a fight to think like, oh, but how could it accommodate this? And then the strategy, at least rhetorically, is don't start with any of that. Just start with some other passages and build up a construction. And if it seems like it fits, then all of the weight will be on why were you assuming it had to be this other way? So yeah, anyways.
Do you have like any worries about skepticism regarding your dedicationality? Because like background was I can't this worry very much, because like when I try to really think about what makes an object an experience, it seems like the spatiality between them is essential. And like, why is this don't look different from these pages? Because they're separated.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like you're using a really subjective criteria, which is space, to individuate things which are now numerical, right? You go from the duality of the appearance to the duality of objects themselves. And that seems always problematic.
Mm-hmm.
So if you apply,
yeah, it's a good question. And the way in the outline handout in number 2, like 2.3, so I suggest, why is there some pressure? Well, on our page 3, under 2.3, so, assume nature either has to be all appearance or all thing in itself. He affirms the actual existence of the things that are in nature, it seems like. So then nature is the realm that has these. Nature can't be the realm of appearances, it must be the realm of things. I want to say, yes, there's something really right about that. But it can't just be the realm of things because it relates to appearances. And so then the other motivation is, well, why? Maybe you would think it has to just only be the appearances, is if you wanted to say, nature itself is in space and in time. And space and time exist only as appearances or in the representation side. So nature can't be things that must be there. So number 5 there, that's a further kind of assumption. Well, in which space and in which time are we placing these objects? And so obviously they relate to the inner time of the flow of our representations, and they also relate to the space that's given immediately in our representation, like our visual display or whatever. But I think he's saying explicitly, like, we apply those to nature, to cognized nature, and in the discussions of the analogies of experience in particular, we have to coordinate the subjective flow of time with something more objective, which he also calls time. And the same thing with space, that the inner immediate display that we have mostly visually that he seems to be thinking about, we have to coordinate that or construct what physical space would be like on the basis of it, and there's an application relation. But then the same kind of question arises, is nature itself in the space of my visual field, that's the only place it is, or in the time of my unfoldings of my subjective representations? And I think he has said enough where we should be at least open to him saying, no, like nature is not just only there. It relates obviously to there, but it's not wholly constituted in there. It also has the objective ordering that's over and against the subjective ordering of temporality, for example, or the objective space of physical bodies that's different than the one that I have immediately in my display, and then I have again, and then I have again. There's some coordination relation or correspondence relation. So that will be one step in the interpretive construction is, once we're getting a little bit more sophisticated about things that could go in the representation side and things that will go with nature, we, like a lot of the post-Kantians, even the immediate post-Kantians will do for Kant, like Helmholtz or whoever, that of course when he's saying the space of intuition, and he means intuition as the subjective representation that is caused in us, that we use to judge and experience about things, the space he's talking about of intuition is going to be like something subjective, psychological, and there will be a question about how do we go from that to physical space. But physical space is just a different space. It's not, and there's never, it's almost like too obvious to have been said that there wouldn't have to be both, and the same thing for time. And so, some people think of that as like, oh, that was the unfolding in a certain direction in the 19th century in philosophical psychology and neo-Kantianism, positivism, other kinds of philosophical movements, of this introduction of a new thing. But what I want to suggest is Kant already is thinking that way. Like that's the right way to already think about the way Kant is thinking about it. So, and other people in the period, like Spinoza, lots of people have something like something subjective and something objective, where space either goes with one and it's extension with the other, or duration and.
Makes this point as a critique of Kant, right?
The who?
Trendelenburg.
Trendelenburg, yes.
Yeah.
Well, right. So, and if you were thinking in relation to Kant, a response should be, well, if all you mean is a subjective thing, then of course, by stipulation, you're just not talking about the physical time or space, and that's okay. But it would be strange to try to say, you haven't ruled out that what you have, in the order of discovery, said is the subjective space in your representations. Why it's not, you haven't argued that it's not identical to the other space, which is by definition not a space of representations. It can feel like, well, there doesn't need to be argument because it's the meaning of the term is just that, so that I feel like the response in that way to a Trendelenburg style question, it fits in the spirit that like, if it really could have been possible that they're identical, of course you would need an argument, but also the whole view would be very different. And the fact that he doesn't think it needs an argument, you need reminders that when you're thinking about your representations and the way things happen subjectively in the flow of your inner time or the space that is immediately given to you and your intuitions, and then you're wondering like, how are the things? You have to keep track of which one you're talking about, but it's never like, and I think when he's thinking about some of the metaphysical positions in relation to the period, that people aren't always so careful about, like, if philosophers, if they're making arguments about metaphysical things having to do with space or metaphysical things having to do with time, if they're appealing to features that really are characteristic of the inner version or subjective version or psychological version, and inferring that they do apply to the outer or physical or whatever, that's fallacious. And so but it's not because it could have worked, but they just did it wrong. It's that they just are misunderstanding the very ontological category of the first one. And so in that sense, the response to Trendelenburg is, it fits more with this kind of style of approach, that there isn't really an issue there, or it's the wrong kind of issue. But I know if other people have any questions or comments. I know you had other ones, but we can come back to them in a second. But
I would like to understand how
yeah.
How he proves the existence of the intuition. Because intuition is the first thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, he infers it from the existence of the outside world that who put it inside us? Like it's before us already.
So yeah.
But he concludes that.
So is the question, why does he think there are intuitions that happen in us, or why does he think that the things he's calling intuitions that happen in us have some relation to something else, or?
I'm not sure if I understood very well. But
yeah.
Intuition means that, as I understood, intuition was the capacity of seeing the world as representations.
So yeah, I think he's thinking about it as.
So where does our capacity come from?
Yeah, good. Okay, so there is and I think this is also just part of the background assumptions in a way, that where we're starting from is, and the way the critique of pure reason starts is, well, let's begin by thinking about the faculties or capacities that are in the human soul, out of which, when they go a certain way, cognition could happen, and then maybe knowledge in the more interesting sense, scientific knowledge or comprehensive knowledge, or and then knowledge and wisdom about the deepest things. If it could come about, it would have to have grown out of these capacities somehow. And so by looking at the nature of the capacities and their powers and also the limitations, we could try to construct to like, well, could it reach this thing that it says it's going to reach? But the whole way it begins is we have these certain kinds of capacities. And so I think he's thinking, and the way he starts the book is like, let me remind you, we have a faculty of thinking, and we have one of sensing or receiving representations. And there's no next part that's like, how do we know we have them, and how do we prove that we have them? That just is how he starts. And so obviously if you were wanting to complete a system where you allow people to ask, with what right do you say we have these faculties? Like, that's a starting point for your construction procedure in the first critique. And some of the German philosophers that are in the same context, they immediately ask him, okay, like, why these? Why just these? Are they really distinct? How do you know? And he will say things like, well, we do have these, they seem like maybe they come from a common root, but we don't know if there's a deeper root. And different philosophers want to know more. It's like, oh, you gave us a hint, like, so is there one? Or like, and maybe we could see how they come from the same root, and we could do a derivation of the one and the other and prove in that way, like, these are the only two and they had to be just this way, and we see them flow from a deeper principle. But he doesn't do that, like himself, and at least in this book, doesn't start with that and then stop and go back to try to examine the presupposition and give a proof. It's just, we know at least this much. And I think rhetorically he's thinking, as Pedro is bringing up, the people that he's in conversation with, like Leibniz and his followers, or Hume and people who are influenced by Hume, or Locke, or even other people like Descartes and Berkeley show up in this one, Berkeley. They're all assuming at least there's this much that is what we're working with. And so even Hume, who doesn't think the understanding or thinking is very different from imagining, still has a distinction between the like receiving of an impression and something having to do with the imagining that's a different act. And so I think he's thinking like, we just know we have at least these two, that's all we're starting with. And can we, even from that limited amount of presupposition, construct questions and answers that speak to the concerns of the philosophers in the time? The next generation has more questions, and so they ask this kind of question like, but how could you, why are you just assuming there's a sensing and a more spontaneous imagining thinking kind of faculty? Like, what's the, so it's a great question, and you are in your own person being inhabited by the spirit of German idealism after Kant or the German philosophers. But he doesn't himself undertake that as a task for himself in these major works. He does think, I think, and again, and just like we were kind of entering into the discussion with experience, that, like Descartes or something, you can become aware of your thinking, and when you are, there's a kind of immediacy to that, and you can become aware of the sensing, and there's a kind of immediacy in that consciousness that you can appeal to in some way. So he calls that relation as consciousness or apperception when it's relating to yourself and your activities. But like the questions of the objects of nature, your own inner nature too is the same kind of thing. You have an inner experience of yourself, but do you know how you are in your own self in abstraction from your experience? And it's a similar kind of puzzle that he thinks we can get into, and we have to be careful about what we say, and we will in our inner experience. We're always judging not just about this representation that's in me or that one, or that there's a series of them, but we're saying of all of them, they're mine, like where it's an object, me. And so we're doing the same kind of uniting, keeping together and then judging that some X is having them all, me. And so there's structurally a parallel, but then also the last step also is parallel, that when we abstract from all the ways that we experience ourselves, and want to just hold that object in thought and think about it as approaching it from the pure understanding, it's a necessary concept. He'll say that again about the inner one too, but how much can we know? And so yeah, so it's a whole space of questions, and you could imagine also that in the generation after, some people were obsessed with this kind of question about the self-relation and the ability for self-consciousness and the immediacy in self-consciousness to function maybe in a kind of like neo-Cartesian way as the ground for all philosophizing. Like you'd have to really start with something like that no matter who considered it when, you could never take it away from them. And that there's sensing and imagining going on, for some people it's like that's not pure or pristine enough or perfect enough, because someone could doubt that probably, or so yeah. But that's it's a great direction of questions. The way that it bears on this would be, should we say something similar about not just the objects in relation to outer sense and bodies, but about the soul, that there's some X there that is the object judged, that is having all the representations and all of the representations of a certain kind when they're connected this way, and in front of my consciousness, I judge of them that they're mine. That's like moving from representations in me to me, in the same way that I move from representations in me to not me, or the objects in nature, especially the bodies. And I think
There are objects inside us as well.
All the representations, yeah.
Even the capacity as well.
Well, right, yeah, the capacities, exactly, yeah.
Laws,
yes.
their own laws as well, since they are
exactly
outside and natural.
Right, so yeah, so what we would want to say is the inner nature, or the matter that's in us, in that sense of existence determined by law, that is me, it should have the same kind of features if it's a part of nature, that it is an existence, it's determined by law, it is what I relate to in my inner experience. It should close itself off. And then the deeper, harder question is the inner nature the same nature as the outer nature, or are there two natures in some sense? And so he will, especially in the parts of the work where once he's introduced the concept of nature, talk about like bodily nature and matter, and then thinking nature and matter. And if you jump into it, you could think like, is it all in the same nature? But it's not clear. And one of the questions is, how does the inner thinking nature relate to the outer material nature? And so when he has reasoning about all this, it's a deep question, like, is it one realm with both? Is there a ground for both that's the same? Or are they two tracks that somehow is one subordinate to the other, and a third? Yeah. So, and I think, and Pedro will be interested in this, of course, from the like idealism, spiritualism direction. The more that the reasoning about all of this keeps going, and so approaching the objects from the point of view of the pure understanding, at least in this far, where you're asking these questions about, okay, we're saying of these objects they relate to our sensings in this way, but we're also holding them fixed and saying they have a kind of standing that's not identical with any of the effects that they have in us, and we're judging about them and we're experiencing them in some sense. What about their own inner constitution, and where did they come from, and can we explain anything about them, or like, can't we know something more? And then lots of questions will come up. Well, okay, maybe in the outer case it's harder because I just go through how I sense, but what about in the inner case? Can I get like into my own inner nature maybe in a different way that's not through sensing or experiencing, but just consciousness of some other kind? And so I can have insight into my own inner nature that I can't have in the outer nature. So that's a question. He has this as a question about the idea, reason forms of the me that's the ground of all of my inner experience. What is it really like, like deep underneath, considered just kind of from the point of view of the understanding or the pure intellect or something. And then once we get good at like these very abstract thoughts, the ground of outer, or the nature as to its standing as just things that do relate to us, but we can also think about them independently of that relation. My own inner nature, also abstracting away from the way I relate to my sensing of myself, but just as myself, and what would explain those. And so the ground of everything that I can think is a third concept that he calls the transcendental ideal, which would include the ground of all reality everywhere. And so those are all, again, concepts we can form and point to, and I think he, especially at this level, thinks these are identical with any of the sensory happenings. It gets very esoteric, but you can see like staggering the structure and making the ontological distinctions in the local circuits that we were talking about at the beginning. If you can't even do it there, then you're never going to keep track of all of this other expansion of the, at least in thought, ontology. And so the ground of thinking nature and corporeal nature will be different than those natures, but those natures will be different than the effects that they have in our sensing, which will be the appearances. And so you'll have like appearances, things that have a way of being in themselves, but also have the effects in us that we experience. But there might be at least one thing that we don't experience immediately. We experience its effects by its effects affecting us. But the deepest ground, it's just a thought that we've reasoned about, and we can point to the object. We just have the thought of it. Could we prove that there has to be such a thing and what it's like or anything? And so this is late into the book, The Critique of Reason. But he's willing to go very far with this construction. And in the Prolegomena, which is much shorter and you can actually read it in a day, the conclusion is much more positive or sympathetic to the commitment to the existence of this kind of ground. I mean, it's like not, well, you thought you were getting nervous when I was talking about things that we experience rather than appearances, but I told you I never meant to doubt those. You're going to get, if you have these other assumptions, you're going to get really nervous when I talk about the ground of those things, which we can't experience that ground, we can experience the things. What about the ground of those things? Shouldn't he say it's either, we can't do anything about it or whatever, just we're way out into esoteric world. Kant can't be that kind of philosopher. At the end of both books, even though it's harder to get in the critique because it's just much longer, many more pages, but by the end of the Prolegomena, you can get there more quickly. His conclusions are not like, we have to deny that is even something we can think about. In fact, it's much more like what he says here, where the concept is not contradictory and it's actually necessary in a way. And reason draws us to be committed to it. And then how strong is the commitment? Some people think it's quite strong. So anyways, I don't know. So it's, So structurally, there might be interesting structural features of the expanded picture, which would be of interest to people who might not be so interested in idealism understood a certain way, but the structure of kind of the differentiation and grounding relations, especially like in the Marxist context or something where you at least have like superstructure ground, and then if you just keep asking, okay, do you need more distinctions here and there, and what will be the causal relations? And when you say material, what do you really mean? Like, do you mean, is the ideology itself still more material? It's like, well, that's not exactly what you mean. It's something more interesting. So, so then it's like giving a Kantian structural analysis of the differentiation that you would need in Marxism at a minimum, and then trying to really ask, like, okay, where is the opposition deeply? Especially on this kind of reading of the Kant, where it's not that one thinks you can just have free-floating ideas.
Darwin will explain things better.
Okay.
Darwin maybe, because things were there before, and then before,
it could be.
We were trying to
Yes.
Arrange things with nature.
Yes, yeah, so it would open different kinds of conversations. Yeah, exactly. Also, we're at noon, so we shouldn't go too much more.
Yeah, I'm so overwhelmed that...
It was too much. I'm sorry. I feel like I talked too much, but...
It's so good that we forgot to give you...
Oh, yeah, we could also...
So,
So,
Yes, no, it's time. I mean, a couple minutes. Very nice to meet you. Thank you, Marco. Yes, I will take some water. Yes, yeah. Oh, too much. Yeah. No, I'm sorry for talking for so much, but.
It's great. Just
no.
for a throat.
Thank you for coming in. If you have thoughts or anything, I would love to hear them at some point. But yeah, no. Yeah.
Okay,
I have to go, but
Yeah.
maybe for another time.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you.
So, I was thinking about Kant's concept of humanism again, like no reading this at the same time,
Mhm.
all phenomenon.
Yes.
And I think this could be a way to approach it.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah.
this was the first thought. The second thought is that you're handling the Kritik der reinen Vernunft, 1781, and Prolegomena, 1783. And 3 years later, he wrote Metaphysische Antwort
Yes.
zur Natur.
Yeah.
And there's a book of Friedman.
Yes.
Yeah, I read it a long time ago, so I had time to catch it up
Sure.
for our conversation. But Friedman goes out to so pity that she's gone, but he mentioned numbers and solidity.
Yes.
And I think the way Metaphysische Antworten is built, it's very interesting because he begins with dynamics.
The first thing is pheronomy.
Yeah, phenomenon.
Yeah.
And I think that's because I'm trying to do the long run with Kant since 1746, the Lebendige Kräfte. And if we take this in account, like he begins his plan with vivid forces and seeing everything as vivid forces, including ourselves, and thinking that of the construction of nature that withholds the things and the appearances, and thinking that the construction of nature begins with vivid forces that are two. In 1755, he mentions that the universal is as he goes to the beginning, the universal has two forces, like expansion and retraction. And at the doctrine of virtue, we mentioned that these forces are correlated to Achtung and Liebe, respect and love. So I don't know, I'm very fragmentary here.
Yeah, no,
I'm
it's
trying
totally.
to,
No, it's
trying
yes.
to
No, it's admirable.
to bring this
Yes.
into my
Yeah.
research. And if we and another thing that another fragment that I have to put into it is that he mentioned that the Kritik der Vernunft that the Ich is leere Vorstellung, empty representation that accompanies the experiences. So looking at this, all those fragments and putting
Yes.
all this together.
Yeah.
Couldn't be this a way to unite this two realms? Because I really
Yeah.
don't think that they are separate. I mean, Kant isn't a dualist. I can't underwrite a sign on paper that says that he's a dualist.
Yeah.
I think he wouldn't otherwise critique Plato as much as he criticized
Yes.
him. Because he said that Plato was a Schwärmer.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes he's harsh with Plato, but a lot, I mean, in the critique, when he brings up Plato, Plato actually gets it pretty much right about reason has to make all these distinctions, and its objects are very particular and special. But no, I mean, the direction I think your attempt to see a thread all the way through, it seems very promising, especially focusing on the human case, that, I mean, other things that are worth having in mind if you're thinking in that long thread way. in the later parts of his lectures and in some writing and in the critical period in general, if he's thinking about philosophy as organized around these three questions of knowing, doing, hoping, and then grouping them all together as if we could answer those, what can I know, what must I do or will, what may I hope, then I would have an answer if I could answer all of those to the question, what is a human being? And so, yes, the concept of philosophical anthropology as a general category of the investigation that could organize a bunch of things, I think is promising and right. And then it would put a lot of weight on like, okay, so what is the human being? Like, so if that's, what are we coming to discover about the human being? And yeah, I mean, here I think, you know, the insistence from Kant that the human being is the name for a being that has these faculties that have to do with sensing and thinking and reasoning, but also the desire and also feeling and the sense of pleasure. And the deeper characterization is there's living, it's a living being, and so it's continuous in that way with living beings in general. And then below that is the harder question, is like, what, is there a dualism within being of living and non-living, and is that a dualism that he would accept? And so then, you know, whatever you might want to say about the difference between an object approach merely from the perspective of the understanding versus approach from sensing, and so the phenomenon versus the noumenon, and then about me, the homo phenomenon or the homo noumenon, if within the domain of the phenomena we judge objects in ways that don't imply that they're living, even though when I judge myself, I have some sense that I'm living, how will those go together? Is that the deepest divide or something? And if there was a realm of being that wasn't even living, then how could it fit together with the aims of life and the higher kinds of life, rational life, spiritual life? How should we think those parts of the world together? And so in relation to nature, this is obviously part of the question for the period in relation to some of the ways Cartesian physics is taken, where there's no life in it, it's just matter, motion, mechanics, there's no final causality or purpose, purposiveness. And then if that nature is the same nature that we were talking about before, that we are also in as humans, then, but our nature seems to have purposiveness, or we know the thinking part and the reasoning part has purposiveness and sets goals and the activity goes towards them. How will that all come together? And so that is the, you know, like you will know in the project in the third critique. And so the question there that's posed, and at least the proposal for an answer is, there is a way of thinking about those aspects of nature coming together. It's not, there's not necessarily a contradiction in the aspects of nature, but it's not straightforward or obvious. And by the end, there is language which can suggest that the perspective of reason on it will be the subordination of, if there is the non-purposive to the purposive, and so the teleological conception of nature will be the ruling one that would explain the other rather than vice versa. But that's in the late parts of the book. But if you're wondering, like, well, if he thinks there should be not a deep dualism, even there, then how do we see that as anticipated in the earlier parts of the work of the critical period? I think it's a great question then, if you look at the metaphysical foundations of nature or natural science, is there an openness there such that the perspective at the end of the third critique could be brought into a consistency with it, such that you could say here it doesn't rule out that the teleological understanding of nature is possible given the way the metaphysical foundations itself is constructed. And so, yeah, I mean, Michael Friedman's work, Marius Stan, a bunch of people have work on that question in really interesting ways. But from our discussion here, the main question would just be, well, if you were thinking that nature is all on the side of appearance, then is that one motivation for pushing it there is because then if you think, well, the human being is not just appearance, it's also a thing, you don't even have to worry about this question because things and appearances are different. Nature is the appearance side, and so all of my teleology and proposiveness and freedom in the rational life just happens at the level of my thingness and not in appearance, and not in nature, because nature is the appearance. There is a kind of neatness to that, but then it really would put the dualism now not within nature between inanimate and animate or proposive versus non-proposive, but between nature as a whole and something else. And so a further indirect motivation for the kind of position that I'm trying to develop is that by placing the things in nature and including living things in nature, not just in the appearance, at least in our judgment, it keeps the tension as being about nature, not about the appearance-thing distinction again. So again, like with this whole stuff, there's reasons why people would be motivated to take the opposite route. But so then what is the human being? It's not just, it has an appearance set and then it has a thing side. We would also have to incorporate its thing standing as to nature that's that's mechanical, and its thing standing as to nature that's above the mechanical or more than mechanical. And so is it right to say of the human being that it has or partakes of inorganic nature at all? And so, because that would be, I think, the question of the dualism and the living force versus non-living force. And so, in the period, the Leibnizians are very pro the rehabilitation of living force and understood that with its connection to life, even if it's not always meaning life in some technical sense, that the gate is open to get to life against the Cartesians. And I think Kant in that way is sympathetic to there's something right. We have to leave that door open always with nature, even in the physics. And so it would put weight on the interpretation of the metaphysical foundations such that you could see at the end of some sections in particular, is there an opening up to this is a construction of this aspect of nature, but it in no way excludes teleology. Like, would we see that? And I think the answer at the ends of sections is he's clearly affirming an openness of a certain kind, and also putting limits on the construction in relation to the absolute idea of nature that reason might have. There's some kind of gap in our construction, not that there's an inconsistency, but more the space for these kinds of roots to get back in. But that's all, that's a whole other kind of discussion. But I think you're right to bring it up just in relation to this kind of project where if, depending on your conception of nature and the nature that we're asking about, if you add to it, it has to be mechanical, or it has to at least have room for teleology, those are further features that haven't really been dealt with here, but are important. Yeah. No, that was a nice question. So should we wrap up because it's noon? Yeah. And we can keep talking, but maybe the official, we can call it for now. But that was great, and I really appreciate you taking the time. I know it was short notice for everyone, so it was great to get to talk with you. And if you have further thoughts as it gets stuck in your head and you're puzzling or you're working on your own things, you can send me an email and just let me know, what about this? Or I read this thing and it's connected, do you know it? Especially if it's in the Brazilian context, because as you can see, my Portuguese, I'm like baby steps into Portuguese, but I would love to learn the community, the options there too. So
they're willing to learn Portuguese?
I'm trying to learn it, but very slowly. It's a world language, and there's millions and millions of people doing things interesting.
You have already a great connection to the Spanish.
Yeah, so that's, it's hard in the speaking because the impulse immediately is to say a Spanish thing, and so then you have to cancel it. It's like, but the reading, makes it way easier because you're like, okay, I can kind of.
It makes us lazy to learn Spanish.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
For example, when I try to learn Spanish properly, we can understand that. If I say
yeah.
Just for the record,
yes.
thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. No, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
A pleasure having you here with us.
My pleasure too. Yeah.
And hope to see you here again.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah, thanks.
Cool.